Thank you very much. We will go immediately into the first session, keeping in time and moment. Can I invite Greg Perry? Greg is Assistant Director at IFPMA. Greg has been very supportive of patient engagement in all matters of innovation, regulatory agency work, and others. Greg, please do take the chair. I'll then invite Julia Spencer. Again, Julia is our stakeholder winning in 2020. I have to say this. In 2020, we were all scared to hell about this pandemic, what's going to happen. And we called all the members of the industry together on an online Global Patients Congress, in which we asked them, where are we going next? And Julia assured us with quite clear indication that we will have a vaccine under 6 months. There are people saying no, 2 years, 1 year. And Julia won the day. We did have that vaccine delivered in 6 months. And Julia comes from that Peter Pivot industry, feet on the ground, developmental, plus the high intellectual. And Julia is now the Global Multilateral Engagement Vice President. This is where you get your multilateral engagement, you can work with them. And has strategic alliances and international relationships at MSD. She'll talk about new agilities or developed during the pandemic. Then online, we'll have Dr. Hanif, who is from the Managing Director of Get Real Institute. This was a project IAPA was involved with the European Union that was looking at real world evidence. As the ministers correctly said that, yes, we do have trials in what is happening among the people? How is this medicine? Is it accepted? Is it working? What about other data like digital data and other centers that are producing data? Real world evidence is really important for us to find those innovative insights. Then we'll have Maria Duarte joining us as well virtually again. Maria Duarte is again director of a very important project in the European Union. It started off as UPATI. It was European Patients Academy on Therapeutic Innovation. UPATI was a patient initiative. I think this is something that's very important to start. Professor Holland is a board member of IAPA, and he's also the president of the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization. Had curiosity before, then Prader-Willi syndrome is another rare, so it's not by accident. In rare diseases, we do need that insight and patient input. And lastly, could I invite BC Bright, our board member, and also first vice chairman and CEO of Living Well Initiative in Nigeria. And she'll speak of role of pharmacists and patients in clinical research and trial. I'll now hand over the session to capable hands of Greg. Please do have some water and okay. Thank you. Greg, over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here this morning. So this panel is on the topic of promoting novel patient partnerships in R&D of innovative medicines and health devices. And I'll just pick up from a few points that have been said by Qualdeep and others. I think one of the key and significant developments of the last decade has been the increased patient engagement in R&D at all levels. We've moved very much from a sort of a short-term outcomes to a much more long-term outcomes, also looking at the full life cycle, I think, of the product. this partnership then that's been developed between, for example, industry and people living with various diseases? Well, shorter development times and in the life cycle, improved pharmacovigilance, and definitely increased patient outcomes and access. So these are part of the philosophy that we're going to discuss today. Also, we are at a time of increasing innovation, treatments, vaccines, technologies,
I'm so glad you came.
devices, personalized medicines, gene therapy, opportunities for breakthrough in areas from oncology, HIV to rare diseases. We've also recently learned a lot from the pandemic, from the COVID pandemic. And by the way, this is my first event I've been to in the post-pandemic. Maybe it's the same for a lot of you, and it's wonderful to be able to say that. But the COVID pandemic showed on-ground importance of regulatory agilities and speedy and effective and safe development of highly efficient vaccines and treatments. So there are a lot of lessons learned that we can bring out of this discussion. I think we're also entering a new era of artificial intelligence. We have a major opportunity with AI, but it also raises a number of ethical issues that I'm sure a number of you are all struggling with and trying to keep up with. So this brings another dimension, I think, into the whole issue of how we work as partners. So I think this journey that we have to innovation it's a journey that's centered around science, but it's a partnership around academia, about industry, regulators, and above all, about people living with diseases, patients. So today then is a discussion around how we have and how we will continue to promote novel patient partnerships in R&D for innovative medicines and health devices. And I'm going to give the opportunity now to Julia to present her views on how new agilities developed during the pandemic in medicine's development, authorization, life cycles. How do we get into a year of disease?
I to thank IFO and this for the opportunity to join this esteemed panel and the incredible audience of patients and patient advocates to talk about what is our North Star, which is patients at MSD. You're at the center of everything that we do, as Greg shared. Our scientists, our manufacturing professionals, our regulatory, pharmacovigilance, quality assurance experts, and our public policy organization, which is what I'm proud to represent today. And in full disclosure, I have not spent my entire career in industry. I spent the first 20 years working primarily for the United States government, doing health policy, but before that, I worked as a unique coalition mobilized role of Southwestern Virginia. That is where I learned that the collective voice of people on anything is the greatest gift. Whether that work on NIH policy, get more innovative medicine, FDA regulating medicines and getting to people faster, or the work that I've done in public health. And I'm really proud to be here representing MSD because we use the power of leading edge science to save and improve lives around the world. And we're proud of our day-to-day work in doing that, but we're incredibly proud also of the work that we did alongside other members of industry during COVID-19. We scale, but we are very proud able to bring forward what was the first author of medicine antiviral for COVID. And I told a story about failures. Failures are just as important. And Our failures were based on science. And yet it shows that perseverance and sustained work is what's needed in order to bring R&D forward. And you go on that journey with us. Our founder, George Merck, famously said, quote, probably been heard by everyone in the room, but I think it's important to ground the discussion that we try to never forget that medicine is for the people. And this philosophy embraces our leaders, it embraces our employees to this day, and it is why we not burden to products to market, but also to ensure equitable access to everyone who needs them as quickly as possible. At every step in our R&D process on a new vaccine or a new medicine, from its production, distribution, availability, patients are critical. This includes patient identification for participation in clinical trials, patient insights into product and packaging design, and the voice of patients in advocacy for work like regulatory system strengthening and policy incentives for investment in R&D, reducing regulatory and trade barriers for market access. I want to use the remainder of my time that I have with my introductory remarks to really highlight two issues. One is regulatory agilities, and the second is the role of patients and the patient voice in R&D. These have been critical in COVID-19, but they are critical. They were critical before COVID-19, and they will be critical now that we are coming out of COVID-19 to make sure that the process for bringing new medicines and vaccines to patients who would benefit from them, and for the need for strengthening advocacy for the kind of health innovation system that we all want to see. So when I talk about regulatory agilities, that's a big buzzword, and I'm looking at Janice in the back, who's IFPMA's regulatory guru, and really what that means is just anything that regulatory authorities did differently that was kind of outside their pre-pandemic standard operating procedures and actions. And I think it's an understatement to say that COVID-19 pushed regulatory science and practices to new heights and brought stakeholders together in ways. And saw it was perfect, but it was the most rapid delivery of safe and effective vaccines, medicines to patients seen in our lifetimes. We cannot expect all agility to become the norm. We cannot expect all for example, regulations and the requirement at a global level provided us as developers with clear and consistent guidance and reduced duplicative submissions and inspections, saving us a lot of time and resources and allowing products to be brought to market. Also, scientific and rolling reviews, rapid review pathways, and earlier and less formal interactions that we had with regulators allowed us to better understand regulators' expectations to tailor our development programs appropriately, align on data requirements. This sounds like a very simple and small thing, but I can tell you that it is tremendously challenging outside of COVID. And for this to continue, there needs to be investment in putting these in place as institutionalized processes from a regulatory perspective. This takes time. Regulatory agencies, even in high-income countries, typically do not have. And so our voice is critically important, developer and patient, to ensure that the resources are there in order to make sure these crucial agilities are moving forward. As I finish up, because Danny has done a great job of keeping me on Swiss time, and as a Swiss resident, I should understand that. We just the broader role that they have in R&D. Some of that is known patients, clinical trials, patient input in product design and making sure that the products meet the patient's needs. But the lived experiences and the insights that patients have much further along in that pathway are also to ensure that once products are available, that they can get to people as quickly as possible, that the supply chains work, that you access the healthcare system, and even what you need to take out of a bottle or a package is by us. And so there's work that we do around the world every day, bringing patient groups together, bringing very diverse voices together. We're not only meeting the needs of one kind of patient, but we're meeting the needs of all patients for all medicine around the world. Appreciate your the opportunity to speak, and I will leave you just with one concluding remark, because I love quotes like our other speakers. Smart, a very brave little girl called Anne Frank once said, "How wonderful it is that we need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." We all have the power to do that, and you all are not waiting, and we are not waiting either. And so we look forward to continuing to partner with patients in the world to improve the lives of patients, which is our mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quote from Frank was very, very powerful. So you mentioned medicine people, you mentioned the important regulatory agilities, which I think we'll come back to that, and the important role of patient culture. So these are issues that will come up in the discussions. Dr. Shahid, are you online?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Dr. I'm going to give you the phone now. Around one partnership.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you virtually. So what I wanted to start with is just a little bit of background about the Get Real Institute. The Get Real Institute was formed a couple of years ago, but it was built off the back of a public-private, which involved all types of stakeholders. And one of the drivers for that was essentially realizing that in an area which was quite complex as the use of real-world data and real-world evidence, that there was a need to bring all of these stakeholders together to align on their understanding as well, and the convergence between them as well. The project, which had a number of inputs which were of collective interest across all of the different stakeholders, and which sought to develop both publications which were on definition, also in resources and tools which could be used by researchers as well. They also identified the need to develop something which would be sustainable, which led to the formation of the Get Real Institute. So the mission of the Institute is essentially to facilitate the adoption and implementation of real-world evidence at the intersection of regulatory and HTA decision-making in Europe. And we're primarily basing ourselves on four key kind of objectives and pillars. First, to act as a collaboration hub for kind of in the EU 45, as well as across some of the Central and Eastern European countries, so that we get diversity of views, but as well as that across the different stakeholders as well. And what we found is that, particularly even amongst the commercial organizations, that it's not just pharmaceutical companies, but there are data providers, and there are health economists, there are non-profit organizations as well who have an interest. And the second is to act as a thought leadership, to facilitate to enable kind of both research and innovation into the space of real world evidence, and then to act as a referential point to be a credible and safe uh, the state, the topic, why is uh, why is a non-profit organization necessary? And the first, as I mentioned, is around this kind of the point around collaboration amongst the stakeholders, particularly where there is an intersection of interest. And in a topic such as, which is so diverse, such as real world data and real world evidence, where each stakeholder group, in a sense, has their own kind of interest. It's very important to be able to have a forum and have a place where there could be dialogue and that we can try to align on where those priorities are. The next is really to bring some of those perspectives together, both the critical ones as well as the where there's alignment as well. It's important for us to hear from a diverse set of perspectives, and patients really form a key role in this, as I found in through my career in a number of other initiatives, which and particularly patient-led, which have really helped to root some of the work which has been developed, and particularly in the UK there was the Wellcome Trust's initiative Understanding Patient Data, which helped to kind of improve our understanding of how patient data was being used, both in this other, but also another called Use My Data as well, which for me was really beneficial because it had patients as well as caregivers as well as part of the discussion, and that bring things to life. The importance of what you do in the necessity for bringing voices to the table as well. So we're looking to provide that safe and neutral different stakeholders to be able to interact from each other and be able to converge on our interests. And quite often, one of the key roles we have is also able to de-risk the engagement amongst, particularly where there could be sensitivities around being in the same room with as commercial organizations and public agencies, for instance. And that's really with a hope to develop shared learning as well as advance areas to the use of real-world data and real-world evidence. And as you will have, I'm sure, have heard over probably the last month, the real-world data and real-world has been playing a kind of a growing and influential role in terms of both in medicine's development, and there's a lot more work to be done within this space. So I look forward to engaging in the discussion and engaging in the conversation and dialogue with you. Thank you.
Dr. Shahid, thank you very much for that. And indeed, the real-world evidence is absolutely key for the future of development of innovation. And thank you for your introduction and indeed for setting up this organization, which is a forum for dialogue. It's important to have a neutral group to do that. That's how we can help build up the trust of the community. Okay, I take the opportunity now to give this call to Maria Dugarte, who is also virtual, yes, and we'll discuss patient engagement and patient industry partnership in medicines and health device research and development. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here today and join this very interesting panel. I'm representing a different type of partnership, EUPATI, the European Patients Academy. We have been providing capacity building, training, and education for patients since 11 years. We were launched by the European Commission Innovative Medicines Initiative in 2012 and are today functioning as a non-profit organization based in the Netherlands. And our vision is really to improve health outcomes through the contribution of patients as valued stakeholder. And And by patients, I would like to highlight that that definition includes individual patients, carers, patient representatives, patient organization representatives, and patient experts and patient advocates. Next slide, please. So the way we see that our mission can be accomplished is through education and training. So we've really focused on training and providing educational materials to patients on medicines R&D and building those skills and competencies for this group in order to work together with the other stakeholders and meet them at the eye level. So I think somebody says, yeah, UPATI's mission is really to bring science to patients in an understandable way and in lay language. And uh, talking about language, this is indeed sometimes the challenge that patients do have a lot to contribute and to say, but do not either understand the language of the other stakeholders or they are not heard. And so everyone needs to learn a common language in order to work together. So T is a public-private multi-stakeholder partnership, and we work together with patients, of course, but also academic institutions, research institutions, non-profit organizations, industry, regulators, and HTA bodies. And together we provide these kind of training materials through an online training program called the UPATI Patient Expert Training Program, but also our toolbox, which is an open source toolbox of articles, webinars, infographics, and other resources on medicines R&D, which is available today in 14 languages. Next slide, please. So a lot has already been said today at this panel about patient engagement in medicines R&D. I'm showing a very complicated chart, and this is available through our website as well. It is a chart that was developed by UPATI in the beginning when we were looking at the different endpoints where patients can and should be involved in the medicines R&D process, and which is also the basis for all of our trainings and materials. These are the different sections and endpoints where we believe patients should have the full capacity and knowledge and be involved. Um, Also, we have heard already today some of the key benefits of why patients should be involved in this process. And I can just repeat what we have already learned, is that this brings about more relevant research priorities from the outset, and the research methods and results are more relevant for patients, and really therapies and health interventions are then better tailored for patients' needs as they are produced. So there are benefits for all stakeholders involved, and we have also seen the impact of this type of education since 11 years that UPATI has been providing this type of training. We see that it has really boosted the patient involvement in medicines R&D. We see that patients are more and more involved with industry, regulators, and HTA bodies, but also in academic research. We have conducted surveys among the graduates from our programs. And also, interestingly, they often become leaders in their patient organizations, and they take those leadership positions uh, and are really empowered by this type of education. We today have 250 graduates from our program, and 100 more are finalizing their studies this year. We have over 6 million users worldwide on the open toolbox on our website, which shows this thirst for knowledge among the patient community. We are active today in 24 countries through our national platforms, which also then translate this material and provide trainings in their own language for the patient communities at the national level. So I think I can only invite you to join and learn together with us from this experience, but also um, um, join our efforts in translating all this knowledge into educational programs and bringing the empowering patients through capacity building. I think the next slide invites you to explore some of our resources and information further. Thank you.
Explaining the important work there of Upati. I like your term of developing a common language, and that patient engagement roadmap, maybe others have seen that before, other versions of it. I think that very well describes the various areas in which a patient or people living with various diseases are important in part of that life cycle, from research priorities down to market authorization. I'm going to give the floor now to our fourth speaker, Tony Holland, who is president of IPWSO. And Tony, the floor is yours to look at the role in how the organization has brought together various activities supporting trials and dissemination findings, and maybe an opportunity to describe the organization
very much, and it's a pleasure to be here at this very interesting meeting. I'm surprised that you said that people may not know about Prader-Willi syndrome. This will be the second rare situation that people have had hearing about Kiribati and now hearing about this rare genetic syndrome, Prader-Willi syndrome. If I can have the next slide, please. Prader-Willi syndrome is a rare neurodevelopmental syndrome, so it's present at birth and should be recognized early in life. And it's a condition of genetic origin, and from birth there are certain symptoms, and new symptoms develop throughout the life, and I can come back to some of those if necessary later in the discussion. But I want to use Prader-Willi syndrome as an example of how the particular challenges that come with having a rare disorder, and the people with rare disorder, what they face and what families face. There are approximately 7,000 rare and very rare conditions that have been identified, and it's estimated that about 30 million people in the European Union live with a rare disorder. About 400 of those 7,000 rare disorders primarily affect the brain. They may be conditions like Prader-Willi syndrome, in which atypical brain development is really key to understanding the person's needs. And other examples, this is not a rare disorder, but Down syndrome would be the one that most of you would be familiar with, but there's Williams syndrome, Fragile X syndrome, and so on. So many different rare syndromes. There are other rare conditions that arise during life and may, for example, be a rare dementia or something like that. But my interest is really to try and illustrate the challenges of these rare neurodevelopmental syndromes and how patient-led organizations, in this case the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization, can help to improve the lives of people with this syndrome and their families throughout the world. What's particularly common about these rare neurodevelopmental syndromes is the importance of early diagnosis. So for parents, they're left with the fact that it's quite clear from birth that there's something wrong with their child. And there's often uncertainty as whether the infant will survive or not. So it's a really very traumatic and challenging time for families. And if a diagnosis can be given early, and that's now possible with many of these syndromes, and it's certainly possible with Prader-Willi syndrome, then at least it can set it in context. If families can have information where there's early intervention, and there are certainly things that can be done for infants with Prader-Willi syndrome, then you can set that in motion. But you can also help parents understand some of the issues that they're going to face as the child gets older and grows into adult life. And it becomes apparent that there's really lifelong health needs as well as social care needs. But I think the second issue that's relevant to understanding the needs of rare disorders is the challenge of research, because clearly research is what leads to new interventions. And the challenge there actually is to engage clinicians and researchers, because until they've heard of the condition, until they've seen, if you like, how fascinating it is, seen the role of clinical guidance and seen the role of research, then they don't engage with it. It's easy in big areas such as cancer research and heart disease, but in rare conditions, you've got to capture your clinicians and get them interested. And I first became, as a psychiatrist, interested in Prader-Willi syndrome because I saw someone with Prader-Willi syndrome. I'd never heard of the condition before, and she'd put on very large amounts of weight because of the particular problems that happened with people with Prader-Willi syndrome. And that grabbed me, and I stayed with it ever since. And can I have the next slide, please? So the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization, the next slide. I think the slides are actually, yes, there we are, thank you. The mission of the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization is to unite the global Prader-Willi syndrome community, really to find solutions and to support and advocate for people with the syndrome and their families. And we do this by the connections we make with national Prader-Willi syndrome associations and professionals who work in the field. We're a membership organization of 45 national Prader-Willi syndrome associations, and perhaps you could be 46 for us, that would be just wonderful. But we have contacts in over 100 countries. We're registered as a charity in England and Wales, and we have a board of trustees of 12 people from parents and professionals from around the world. And you can see on this slide our priorities to promote evidence-based interventions, to provide responsive and effective supports, and to grow and strengthen the global Prader-Willi syndrome community. And I've set out some of the challenges that we face in doing this, particularly given that it's a rare disorder, and I'll come back to some of those in my last slide. If we can have the next slide, please. The next slide will show you just is a map of the world when it moves on. There we are. And you can see the countries that are members in purple and the contacts that we have in other countries. You can see there's a big gap in the continent of Africa where we're just beginning to have contacts. And the next slide, please. So just to say something about what the International Prader-Willi Syndrome Organization does. So our stakeholders, if you like, are both health professionals and other professionals, such as teachers, because people with Prader-Willi syndrome have very special needs at school, but also people who will provide social care, because people with the syndrome will need support throughout life. But of course, central to this is people with Prader-Willi syndrome, families and support networks. So we provide that global glue, if you like, for that, and we do things like provide information, diagnosis. We run international conferences and workshops. We run global summits, and these are often around contentious issues. And we've just had one about the need for controlling access to food, and that's a fairly contentious issue. But perhaps the greatest innovation we've had recently is run what's called an ECHO program, and that's a tele-mentoring program developed by the University of New Mexico in the United States that brings together people and communities. And we develop best practice guidance and promote and disseminate research. And my final slide. So there are very particular challenges because of the differences and variation in need across the world, differences globally in terms of economic and cultural differences, different languages, the time zones. There's the complexity of need across very many medical disciplines and social care. And there's the challenges of the governance of a small global international charity. And if I could just show my final slide and then I will end. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions later.
Tony, thank you very much. Explaining the work you're doing, the condition. I noticed those challenges: access to care, diagnosis, cultural needs, technology. That's something I think maybe many patient organizations share with you there. I thank you for raising the issue around a number of rare diseases. Also very interested about the ECHO program, and maybe we can discuss that a little bit more, but thank you very much. Now, you mentioned Africa in there. You mentioned the challenge there of bringing Africa. That brings us over to Bissy, who will discuss the role of Africa, pharmacists and patients in clinical research in Africa. And I think the overall challenges in Africa, which has its unfair burden of diseases, specific diseases in the area, but also a continent which is clearly demonstrating stronger institutional responses. The floor is yours.
The person who is sick. When we talk of patient partnerships, we're looking at the patient body, that's patient organizations. We're also looking at patient advocates. I know there are a lot of patient organizations here today, patient advocates, and of course the patient themselves. So I'll be speaking both from the angle of being a pharmacist and also from the public health angle, because I'm also a public health practitioner, and also from the organizational angle, because I run a patient organization called the Live Well Initiative. Now, the importance of health system research cannot be overemphasized, and when Julia was speaking, she was calling for partnerships with patient organizations, I really saw the importance of that, because the patient is the end user of the drug, of the medicine, and no improvement in the system. So looking at it within the Live Well initiative, I want to share the personal experience that we've had on the job. We were able to design study protocols for the COVID-19 response in Africa, and we had in mind a response that would be affordable, innovative, and realistic, and useful for Africa, considering all the constraints we have in Africa. You see that Professor Holland just talked about some of the constraints they have reaching Africa. We know that Africa has some peculiarities, and so we designed these study protocols by repurposing 4-aminoquinolines, which is a class of medicines that have been used before. You know, when you talk of repurposing medicines, you are saying these medicines have been tested and proven in another area, and then we now brought them into virology. And the patients were involved right from the first day. How did we involve patients? We brought in medical practitioners and pharmacists to start up a debate. And so we wanted to test this hypothesis. Will 4-aminoquinolines Will the virus respond to these 4 aminoquinolines? And that was the hypothesis which we tested. We started with debates among pharmacists and physicians, and we ran these debates for about 6 weeks, after which some of the physicians started to try out the protocols and were placing patients on the medicines, and that was the next phase. We actually did also involve some virologists. And it got to the stage where within my country, Nigeria, we actually had a few state governments that decided to adopt the study protocols. And some adopted it unofficially, but one particular state government, Oyo State in Nigeria, adopted the study protocols, the LWI study protocols officially, and used the study protocols to treat their COVID patients. The protocols were applied for all the different strains during the Delta phase, the Omicron, etc., etc. And from inception, from day one, when the Oyo State Isolation Center was established, to date, they never had one single case of mortality. So the success was totally unprecedented, and it was simply the 4 aminoquinolines that were applied. Now, the patients were involved from day one, and we had a variety of patients. We had very young COVID-19 patients. They were patients that were PCR tested positive. We also had very elderly patients. In fact, the oldest patient was a 91-year-old who survived it, but was on admission for about 22 days or so. So we've been able to publish the data in open access international scientific peer-reviewed journals, and the work is still ongoing, and the patients have been involved from day one. Now, what was the importance of having the patients involved? That could give a very good feedback, number one. Number two, we found that it also drew up the interest of the patient advocates and the patient groups and so on. And with this, we found that it was to follow up easier, much easier, because patients were involved, to follow up with the patients. And so we did not even have the recrudescence. One of the other advantages was that fallouts like the long COVID, we never had any of that in Oyo State. And then things like recrudescence, or people who came up with heart complications and so on after going through the pandemic, we did not have any of those. So these study protocols were very good, and the partnerships with the patient gave us a very novel outcome, which is, it is still an ongoing work. And we will be happy to work with any interested parties on this research. And it's given us quite a leeway, because we started off involving pharmacists from the beginning, and the pharmacists were involved with the physicians, with the hypothesis testing, and so on. So these novel partnerships will always end up positively if they are adopted. And I'll just quickly conclude with a very short statement, because I see KS is here reminding me that it's time. Sorry, a very quick statement on the importance of such novel partnerships. So an empowered patient means a formidable health system swarmed with innovative medicines and novel partnerships. So without novel partnerships, the health system research will be very dull, will be limp, and it will be mundane. So patients need to be empowered, and patient organizations need to be increasingly and officially involved in health system research at every stage for more innovation and for more novel outcomes. Thank you very much.
That's a very nice concluding point. I think for me, when I mentioned about the journey at the beginning, I mentioned academia, I mentioned industry, I mentioned regulators, I mentioned patient health. I did not mention the importance of healthcare professional. And I think that is clearly an important part of that partnership and the journey moving forward. I was very interested in the study protocols that you mentioned. And you mentioned it also, the importance from an African perspective around the vaccines. I didn't get them all, but it was affordable, usable, appropriate. You mentioned another one as well. I can't remember.
Affordable, realistic.
Realistic, yeah, okay. So I think these are all very important concepts that we have to think about. Now, we have the opportunity, we're well on time, because there's a lot of discipline coming from the floor there, which is very good. I'm going to continue the discussion between the panelists, but then we're going to open up to questions. And first I'm going to turn to Julia, if she'd like to build on anything that she mentioned before, particularly around centricity and the regulatory alliance, and also to comment on anything that other panelists have said.
Sure, thank you. And, I was writing a lot while my fellow panelists were talking. I always find I learn more than I share in these kinds of panels. And I think one of the key things that I want to provide a little more detail on is the way we really engage patients during our development process. It really is two parts. One is ensuring that we are getting insights from patients throughout our development pathway to use inside as we are developing medicines or doing incremental innovation to improve those medicines for the people that need them. But we also take those insights and then ask ourselves, what can we do externally to be able to support patients and patient groups? And so around the world, that may look different. I was really intrigued by your comment about bringing together a collective voice, Penella. And in Europe, that's one of the things that we've done, is we've brought together patients and patient organizations that represent really what the most vulnerable and maybe marginalized populations are in Europe, to have that single collective voice for empowerment on their healthcare. In other places like Australia, it has been grant fundings to patient organizations to develop technology and digital assets to help patients throughout their patient journey during COVID, when they couldn't have access to face-to-face care with their healthcare practitioners, or it's through the work that we're doing as a member or as a partner in initiatives like Get Real and like UPATI, to make sure that the evidence is there, the evidence is understood, patients are educated about how to get involved. And so that creates this really, really important continuous loop where patients, patient organizations, healthcare practitioners, and developers are doing everything that we can to try to advance, ultimately, the outcomes for patients. And so I think that's an important piece. And then I also wanted just to talk about health equity in all of this, because that's something, and I'm seeing nods all around the room for those of you that are online, because health equity is such a broad term, and this is something that we are really leaning into as an organization, and certainly as part of the broader industry. And so we are trying to look inwardly to say, what can we do different as an organization to try to ensure better health equity? And then we also are saying, what can we do in partnership with others? And so I think that's just even an open invitation to say that we know what we know as an organization, like all of you know what you know as organizations. And really it is when we talk to each other and we understand each other's lived realities and constraints and opportunities that we can continue to co-create things together.
Okay, thanks very much, Julia. Now, maybe we can bring up that issue of health equity when we come from questions from the floor. Thank you very much there. Going back to Dr. Shahid Hanif, I have a couple of questions, too, that I wanted to give to you. One was, for you, what were the most significant outcomes from your work as what recommendations would you like to share with all the technical research teams? The second question actually is, how do you perceive the future?
Sorry, you trailed off a little bit. I think I did hear the first question, so let me just address that. First, I think some of the most significant achievements in many ways was really this initial step of bringing some of the stakeholders together prior to the formation of the kind of the IMI public-private consortium. I think there were very kind of sporadic initiatives which involved a few stakeholders coming together. But this was a kind of an initial huge effort to bring a lot of the different stakeholders together and really highlight some of the major challenges which were facing the incorporation of real world data and real world evidence into medicine's development. And particularly one of those was around the exploration of some of the case studies to see, well, what are the issues and challenges of completing some of those case studies. And one of those, the big challenges was around access to data. And I think, as you've probably found over a number of years, that that's still a huge issue, not just for commercial organizations, but also in terms of from public agencies, from government agencies, about how do they manage, and healthcare organizations, how do they set up the governance appropriately in order to better use healthcare data, both for patients within healthcare, as well as those for other uses as well, and other research purposes as well. And in terms of where we're going as a direction and as an ambition moving forward, I think what we see is that there's much call for a need for multi-stakeholder dialogue, and in some ways, Get Real has traditionally prided itself on not just being a kind of a convener for discussion, but a convener for putting that into practice as well. And that's been reflective in a few of its outputs, which where it's looking to develop translational tools or translational kind of information resources, which really help both kind of researchers as well as the different stakeholders in terms of their understanding. So, and this is where I think we feel that we want to play a role, is to be able to convene those stakeholders and to identify how we can address those challenges that are at the intersection, but go beyond that and think about what is it that we need to do to put some of those things into practice as well. And I think one of those aspects which I will highlight, certainly from a patient kind of perspective. So I think at the moment, Get Real Institute obviously moved from a European-funded public-private partnership to now a member-based association. So we have a kind of a diverse set of members, and I think certainly the one area where I feel that we need to have more of a voice is from those areas identified, particularly from healthcare professionals and as well as patients as well, as to what are their specific kind of needs and what are the specific challenges relating to real world data and real world evidence. And I think you, Patty, obviously are addressing that, particularly in terms of the education and the training needed for patients in terms of engaging in medicine's development. And that's an area which we're also engaged in terms of setting up an academy for the different stakeholders. But in addition to that, I think it's helpful to understand some of those key issues that patients have and to work out how we can bring them to the conversation with the other stakeholders in order to address them. And you'll have to remind me of your second question, please, Greg.
Maybe a quick comment about how you see the development of artificial intelligence impacting on the work that you're doing and the future of global data and information.
Yeah, I guess as many of you are aware, kind of AI generated data as well as machine learning is, I mean, it's an expansive area. And I think obviously there are various issues still relating to the trust of that data, the ethical issues around that. the kind of the issues around bias, but there's also a lot of potential benefits from using that, which I think Julia could probably speak to a lot better than myself, particularly in medicines development, both from a clinical trials perspective to look at eligible patients for inclusion and exclusion for clinical trials and what the effects of that would be, as well as for drug targeting, and also in the post-marketing and looking at pharmacovigilance and patient safety as well. But I mean, it's inevitably going to have a growing role. And I think one of the challenges, obviously, from both the legal framework and from the commission, obviously, with is setting up that framework, but as well as from the public agencies as well, is how do they set up certain standards to look at that evidence as well. And I know there's some work also looking to see, well, how do you look at some of the evidence generated from machine and learning and AI, and where does that fit in terms of the hierarchies of evidence? How can that be trusted across some of the different stakeholders as well? So I think it's going to be an interesting area which will continually emerge, and this is where I think it's going to be. We're going to need a lot of these diverse views to really be able to deal with some of those issues as they arise collectively.
Okay, Shay, thank you very much for that. And again, we can pick up on some of those issues, particularly on that framework and regulation around AI. I thought was important. You yourself mentioned you, Ati. Go back to Maria now. Two related questions, really. Done a lot of work there in Europe. Is there a plan? How does this relate maybe to other regions of the work that you've done, particularly in low and middle income countries? Particularly, your concept where you recommend patient co-designers, co-leads, co-reviewers of the clinical research process. How well is that accepted, and how key are you in trying to promote that? Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Indeed, our name is the European Patients Academy still, but we are reaching beyond Europe. So I mentioned the 24 national platforms that we have today. One of them is indeed established in Japan, and our materials are available today in Japanese. So the expansion, the global level expansion has already begun. We have today patients who are being trained through our programs from the US, from Australia, and India. So we see that there is a growing interest for this type of training beyond the European borders, and obviously we hope to address this challenge and invite patient communities all around the world. As to your second question, how is this approach accepted among the other stakeholders? I see that there's a growing interest among researchers from academia and industry, for example, to also be trained in patient engagement, how to actually implement that, what are the different skill set needed for the professionals as well. And we as UPATI have expanded our capacity building to also include researchers and representatives from industry and academia as well, where we see that we bring the UPATI fellows, the patient experts, there as trainers, so they also can speak to their actual experience of working within patient engagement projects with the other stakeholders. And these are very, very interesting workshops where we learn together. And so I think there is a paradigm shift happening. We see that researchers see the benefits, and also more and more trust is being built through this type of public-private partnerships, as we've heard also other panelists presenting. That there is a common understanding now that we need to work together, and there are good models to make that happen, and it will benefit all of us. What I would like to add is that it is still a challenge. We see that patient organizations especially are under a lot of pressure. It takes a lot to be an efficient patient advocate today. A lot of complex issues entering this area. We've heard digital health, medical devices, cell and gene therapies, for example. Our capacity building needs are also expanding and rapidly, so that we see today it is very, very complex challenge to take on for the patients, but patient organizations, and under a lot of pressure as well in terms of the financial situation and so on. We saw this also in the recent political turmoil in Ukraine, for example, how patient organizations needed to act quickly, but were resilient facing that challenge. So I think it's a very complex landscape, but these challenges can be tackled when we work together in strong partnerships like this.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned the important term paradigm shift and also the building of trust. It's a very important development and also important concept. It leads me really to Tony. They say you have to match the message, the messenger, and the medium in the most creative way to make an impact when sharing clinical trial results. Does ECHO and your personal insight think the patient is the best messenger? And also, I find this very interesting. How do you prevent patient-generated infodemic? I've got the term here. For example, patient WhatsApp groups sharing without fact check. There's a big issue, I think, all of us in this.
It's a very, very big issue, and not everyone come to that. Just to stick with it a little bit, Barry.
Yeah.
I mean, ECHO was developed, as I mentioned, by what is now the ECHO Institute in just to tribute to Lara Bloom, who's here, I think, from the Los Angeles, hi Lara, who really introduced ECHO to us. It's an ideal system for rare disorder. It uses Zoom technology long before the pandemic to really develop communities that improve outcomes, people not necessarily with rare disorders, very suitable for rare disorders. So we've had communities of what we call leaders from across the world, so people. Thank you. People who we see as leaders in their country, so these are parents, usually parents. We've had professional groups from across the world, we've had social care providers, and so getting together on a regular basis to share ideas and exchange. So ECHO, I think, is a really very good system for doing that. It has come at a very good time in the world of Prader-Willi syndrome, where we are seeing clinical trials. And clinical trials that are there to try and treat the overeating, the hyperphagia, and particularly some of the psychiatric problems that are of particular interest to me. And patient groups, I think, are really important, or parents, and it's usually parents here, but not always. We're trying increasingly to engage people with Prader-Willi syndrome themselves. But I think one of the problems in the area of neurodevelopmental syndromes is there's still a historical suspicion of research, because of things that happened in the past in terms of unethical research and so on. But at the same time, parents particularly are saying to us, our children have major needs, there must be new treatments. And there's a tension there. So I think that part of the importance of engaging parents when it comes to clinical trials is helping to manage expectations as well as the practice of the clinical trial. I say manage expectations because so often people enter trials in the belief that there will be a positive outcome. And one has to say the purpose of the trial is to determine whether there's a positive outcome. And we found in Prader-Willi syndrome, there's been one trial looking at the overeating where there were serious side effects, so it had to stop. Another trial in which the findings were negative, and another trial in which there's a real balance as to whether they're effective or not. Clinical trials are not easy, and parents are the people that are helping us give that message about that. So managing expectations, overcoming suspicion, helping with recruitment, I think is really important. And we use ECHO as well as just standard virtual systems to communicate that issue. This question of the infodemic, I think as it was called, I think is a really, really critical one. And one of the things I think that is really important is an organization such as IPSWO has very strong global clinical presence. And that we're absolutely clear that what we have on our website and what we tell people is rooted in the science as we know it. Now, and we're also clear where there is uncertainty. And one of the things we do is produce good clinical guidance, documents which we translate into many different languages that really sets out what we see as the level of our understanding, the standards of treatment and the types of treatment and so on. And that's the best we can do. It doesn't stop families going to other sites, but we can try and pull them back when they do and say, this is what you need to look at.
It's really interesting. Of course, I think we're also living in an era where there are some people sometimes don't want to live with dogs, but yeah, so but,
you're talking about the UK here.
Well, we won't go into Brexit here, but that's a good discussion. You mentioned found evidence again. You mentioned the importance of trust again for families around the clinical trials. We talked to the role of patients, coming back there to healthcare professionals, and looking again at the role of pharmacists, basically. I mean, you want to expand on your thoughts around how the role of pharmacists can be within the clinical research teams, how you're interacting with patients, because you really are, there with the patients, what you consider to be pharmacists to be an important part of the real-world evidence as well.
Thank you. The role of the pharmacist is so key, and it is evolving, especially in the area of clinical pharmacy. I'm actually a clinical pharmacist by background, but I'm also a public health practitioner. But I've found that the role of the clinical pharmacist is evolving. For example, when we started the research on COVID-19, it started, with just with kids' gloves, a very minor thing, and then we started with the hypothesis testing. But the role evolved more and more, and we ended up forming a clinical research team. We had a 19-man clinical research team. And although I'm a clinical pharmacist and not a physician, I emerged as the lead in that team, and we had 3 field investigators who are physicians on the team. Is definitely a very key one, the role that the clinical pharmacist plays in the research team. You find out that things that people would probably have taken for granted, you bring it in scientifically, and people can then look at it from a different angle. And then because the pharmacist is usually the last port of call within the health system before they go home with medication or whatever, you find that the pharmacist can bring in those things that they get from the patient and start bringing some of the feedback into the system. And that is one area that is very important, the feedback from the patient. And when UPATI was presenting and talking about how they are training and coaching and empowering patients, I actually jotted a few key points, because the way we do it, we start with the patient partnerships by empowering them, and then we graduate them to the next level where, apart from being empowered, they become patient experts. And who are the patient experts? They don't even have to be educated. Some of them are low literacy patients, never been to school, but we make them experts. For example, we have trained low literacy women who've never been to school. We've trained them as hepatitis champions, and they are now advocates and experts in their own way. And then we've also empowered patients not to be stigmatized. So it's part of empowerment when a patient knows that I don't need to wear a stigma. So that makes it easy for the break barriers, give you a good feedback which can help in your research. And then after they become patient experts, we now take them out there as activated patients. So they're not just experts hidden somewhere, they are patient experts that can go out, come to a conference like this. I look forward to the day when we will have activated patients sitting in the midst of us here, or even at regular healthcare conferences. That is the way to go, and that's what we've been doing gradually at the Live Well initiative, and it is really good. Although because we're a non-profit, we don't have the financial muscle and all that, but we're doing it and it is really working. And with our research team, the pharmacist has been given a central role, and that's how I evolved as the lead of that team. It's a clinical research team. So the role of the pharmacist is definitely very important. Thank you.
That's really fascinating. I'll be honest, it's the first time I've heard the term patient expat and activated patients. That reminds me more of times I had the privilege to work in the area of HIV and the importance of communities. And as community pharmacists working with communities, it's fundamental. And of course, we have a lot to learn from what you're doing in Africa on the ground everywhere in the world. So this is really inspiring stuff. We got great, it's 15 minutes, I think I've got left for about 15 minutes for questions from the floor. Colby, I think you're going to help organize that, yeah?
Hello, I'm Tessa Richards, editor at BMJ. Thank you so much for your presentations. Just a quick comment, BC, I just loved you raising about having patients at every conference. Are you aware of the patients included charter? It's to do with conferences, and conferences can self-accredit themselves for being patient included. And that is not just having them, you know, sitting in the audience, but co-designing the agenda, having a role sitting on the panel, etc. Anyway, that's an aside. But my real question actually was for Hanif at the Get Real Institute. Real world data, we've talked in it at a high level so far, but in the context of, for example, the tuberculosis, the vaginal mesh, which everybody I'm sure knows about, the problem was there wasn't any good long-term data being collected on patient outcomes, collated, analysed and presented. But so much misery has been caused by that. So what is the Institute doing about, you know, post-marketing surveillance data, following things up in the long term with new drugs, new devices in particular?
Dr. Andy, did you hear that question?
Yes, I did. Thank you. So the way Get Real was initially set up, it was particularly with a focus on medicines and vaccines and less so on devices, and that was just because of it being part of the IMI initiative, which was, as I say, primarily focused on medicines. But I think what your question at the end of the day kind of relates to is how do you collect information better and utilize information better within healthcare settings so that there is better insight both for decision makers, whether they are kind of clinicians, whether they are or public agencies, for instance, as well. And I think there's traditionally been a lot of work around the collection and use of real-world data and evidence in the post-marketing space, and quite often, even from a patient perspective now, there are a number of initiatives which are looking at the collection of patient-reported outcomes as well as patient experience data as well. I know the PFMD are looking into particularly focusing on patient experience data, and quite recently there was also a workshop which was organised by the EMA on patient experience data as well. So those kind of areas are beginning to emerge a bit more in terms of how they're set up and how to develop the right kind of standards and expectations for collecting post-marketing data. But I think certainly from an industry perspective, perhaps Julia also has more to add on this topic as well.
Okay, thank you. No, okay. Thank you. Next question.
Question from the audience online. I'll combine the questions. I think it's very important. There's a question coming in from Brazil. I think they're just waking up with their coffee. And there's a question from Fiji, a very interesting one. What the two sense of how is it important to include indigenous peoples in research, knowing very well that some genome phenotype may hide secrets for us? To anybody.
That's a really interesting question. We didn't touch on the need for ethnic diversity in clinical trials. Can I go to you first, Julia? Because I know, and then I think we'd like to.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I will say that I think none of us does that perfectly, but as a company and certainly as an industry, this is something that we feel quite strongly about. And I think it goes back to what I was saying about continuous loop. There has to be trust from patients to come forward to participate, and we have to know how to reach them, and we have to reach them in a way that they feel is accessible. We have a lot of programs that we do internally, trying to get as diverse of a pool of potential participants for clinical trials as we can, and then externally working with other groups, providing resources as well as partnerships to try to do that, because we do believe that it is critically important, both from a scientific perspective in the research, but also to ensure that ultimately those products are what people need and can get to them to benefit them.
Great.
Thank you.
I think Bissy would like to comment as well on that.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add a quick comment. We actually work with indigenous patients. There's a place in Lagos called Makoko. It's the biggest slum in the world, the biggest riverine slum in the world. You can Google it. It's spelled Makoko. So we have a small health post in Makoko. And so we treat patients there, among which we have indigenous populations. And we take in interns from the Harvard University in Boston. They usually come all the way from Boston to Lagos to that Makoko slum. And we are doing some work on viral hepatitis with them. And we found that that particular indigenous population that we are working with, there is a lot of specificity and sensitivity that shows a very strong association between viral hepatitis and that particular population. And it was a student in Harvard that did that work. We are looking for more students to follow up on the work, but with research, you need funding and all that. That is what is stopping us. So yes, indigenous populations should be involved in research, and we are doing that already, and we're looking for partners to help us to scale this, because yes, we're working with the Harvard University, but it's an internship program which they call the Open Field Practicum. We've been doing this with Harvard for 7 years now, but it is not a funded program. So if we could get a partner who is interested in research for indigenous populations, I'm sure that project would fly better. Thank you. It's a very interesting result we have. Thank you.
We'd be happy to know more about that, actually, Bissy, and that's a great call. It was interesting. The question came from Brazil, and for this global conference, as you said, there were many hundreds online. Sorry, next question.
Thank you very much. The presenters, I'm Flavia Chomkama, I'm from Uganda. I come from a patients organization, Action Group for Health, Human Rights and HIV. But I also am a patient, not a patient really, but I live with HIV for a number of years and I'm a cancer survivor. My particular concern is around the issue around development of vaccines, and I'm particularly concerned about the COVID vaccine. You did mention, was it, I don't recall your name, but you talked about need to develop rapid medication because there was a need. But I also wonder if we have any kind of follow-up mechanism to see the effects of the vaccine to communities, to feed back into whether we need to have a better or improved one, because it was so rush and rapid, and we have all this suspicion in communities. How do we mitigate that kind of suspicion that continues, that people think it is was just to pass time, to hurt people? And currently, people drop dead and they think maybe it's this vaccine. Is there a kind of mechanism of following up to see those who took the vaccine, how they are responding, how it interacted with some of us, maybe who are on ART, whether there are any, that kind of long-term pharmacovigilance to ensure that we don't have adverse effects that are coming from the vaccine, but from also maybe interacting with other drugs. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good question because it relates also to pharmacovigilance and post-marketing surveillance, which has been mentioned before. Also about information that is out there that's going through patients. But Julia, do you want to say anything specific? Because I think that the question was related to what you said.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I cannot talk about specific COVID-19 vaccines. We do not have a licensed or authorized COVID-19 vaccine. But what I can talk about is both the information piece as well as just generally from a pharmacovigilance. So I'll speak about our COVID therapeutic. Maybe that's an okay analogy, even though it's not exactly the same. So, as an innovator, we worked in partnership with a number of manufacturing organizations, either through manufacturing partnerships or through voluntary licenses with generic companies in order to ensure that we had equitable access to our product once it was authorized. And part of that, as the innovator, is that we are responsible for that global network of pharmacovigilance, because you are right, and it was even more important in COVID because of the speed at which these products came to market. I am not a regulator, but in talking to regulators, this was also a concern of theirs, and that there was assurance that even though things moved quickly, decisions were made in parallel, that there was no quality that was reduced as a result of that. And I think that took everyone kind of locking arms to be able to talk about how you talk about that publicly. But we, as an innovator, are required to do pharmacovigilance, and I will also say that the pharmacovigilance systems in countries around the world are not what it should. It's probably an area that needs to be strengthened. But from the industry side, that is something that we do. I will also speak about the information challenges because I was actually working in vaccines during vaccine policy during COVID. Vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy and concerns around the safety or the efficacy or the quality of vaccines was not new. This has been around since smallpox, and COVID, I think, just exacerbated that challenge. And again, this is one of those areas where COVID just put a spotlight on things that we need to face as a community going forward. It's something that MSD was doing before COVID, and it is something that we continue to do. And one of the partnerships that we actually started up even in the early days of COVID was an organization called the Alliance for Advancing Healthcare Online, which is providing funding to researchers to understand how people access information online and they use it to make health decisions. Because this is a crisis, this is a pandemic just as big as COVID was a pandemic. And so if you'd like any more information on the work we're doing on that, we have a number of partners, including the WHO and Meta, then I'd be glad to follow up with you on that.
Okay, thank you, Julia. I know where...
No more questions for me, please. No, just kidding.
We're heading to the end. I'm in your hands.
Almost, just one suggestion, a comment. Somebody is a patient advocate from Africa, patient champion from Africa. He recommends every country to adopt the Global Patient Safety Action Plan, 2021-2030. I think we should all take it up. Ministers, maybe you can take it to the Commonwealth. So yes, that plan needs to be revised because it's 2 years since it's been signed by everybody. And
We discussed that last year.
Yeah, last June we discussed
did that, yeah.
So thank you very much. And
Shall I wind up? Yeah? Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, thanks to all the participants here, Julia, Shahid, Maria, Tony, and Missy. I think it was a very engaging discussion. Thank you for everybody in the audience for questions. Concluding then, medicines are for all people, and engaging people living with the diseases and conditions is key to the future of innovation, whether it be vaccines or treatments or diagnosis. And all through the life cycle of a product, but key to that, of course, is partnerships. I really think all those that are engaged in various partnerships, including those of you that are in the audience, but obviously then it's people and partnerships which are the future for innovation. Thank you very much.